The long lull sat on the dark face of Erevan, and in 19 years no one had ever asked me to describe it, so I never learned a kind way to. It was a grove of the sleeping. Rows of low cradles under a roof of black glass, each cradle holding one of the Othrani who had gone down into the long sleep and not come up, the wasted, the failing, the ones the Greyrot had touched and not finished. They were not dead. That was the cruelty of the place. They breathed. Their chests rose under gray blankets, slow as tide, and their faces held the small private weather of dreaming, and they did not wake, and they were not expected to. The grove was where you brought what you could not heal and would not bury. Erevan never turned its dark face to the sun, so the grove never saw a true dawn. We made our own. We called the hour the lamps came up dawn because we needed a word for it, the way you need a word for anything you are going to have to live inside. I carried water. That was my work, and it had been my work since I came down the supply line a young man and stayed a not young one. Water and the small freight of a grove clean cloth, the gray paste they fed the sleepers through reed and patience, lamp oil, the bins of spent linen that went out the low door and never came back. I walked the rows at the start of every night with the yoke across my shoulders and 2 drums swinging, and I filled the basins at the foot of each cradle so the tenders would have what they needed for the dark hours. I was the only human on Erevan. I had been the only human on Erevan for so long that the strangeness of it had worn down to nothing, the way a coin wears smooth in a pocket until you cannot read the face. I tell you about the water because the water is how I learned the rule, and the rule is the whole shape of this. The Othrani do not touch what the Greyrot has touched. They have reasons that are old and reasons that are true and reasons that are neither, all braided so tight you cannot pull one strand without the others coming. The Greyrot is a wasting blight. It comes in slow, grays the skin in streaks like ash worked into a wound, and most who take it go down into the long sleep and do not return. A few live, a handful out of the thousands. They live and the gray stays in them, banked in their skin in those charcoal streaks, and the Othrani look at those streaks and see the blight still in the body, sleeping, ready. So they will not touch the marked. They will not eat from a dish the marked has held. They will not let the marked stand within reach of the unmarked, and they have a whole grammar of distance built around it, the length of a tending rod, the width of a passing lane, the bow that is not a bow but a stepping back. And because the marked may not be touched, and because the sleeping must be touched, turned, cleaned, fed, kept from going stiff and sore in their long stillness, the Othrani gave the work of the sleeping to the marked. It is the one labor the doctrine permits them, because it is a labor the unmarked do not want. The marked tend the sleeping with their bare hands. In a grove no clean hand will enter, on the dark face of a moon, through hours that have no morning. The Othrani call them the cinder-tended. They say it the way you say, a thing you have decided not to think about. I had filled basins beside the cinder-tended for years, and I knew them the way you know weather, as a condition of the place, not as persons. I am not proud of that. I am telling you the truth of where I started so you will believe me about where I ended. The night I am going to tell you about, I came down the 8th row with the yoke and I saw her at the far cradle, and I will say plainly that I did not know yet that she was anything. She was a tender among tenders. Rose-gray skin gone the color of the hour just before a real dawn, the charcoal streaks running down her forearms and up the side of her throat where the rot had marked her and let her keep her life. Dark hair near black, grayed at the temples, not with age, I learned later, but with the blight which silvers the hair where it crosses bone. She sat on a low stool at the head of a sleeper, an old man by the cut of his face, and she had her bare hand flat on his chest, and she was singing to him. Not loud, not a song with words I could hold. A low thread of sound, 3 notes turning over and over, the kind of thing you do with your voice when you have decided someone should not be alone in the dark even if they cannot know you are there. I stopped with the yoke on my shoulders and I listened, and the grove was the grove, all that breathing, all that black glass, and her 3 notes went up into it and got lost, and she sang them again. I set her basin down without a word, which was the rule, and I moved on. But I had heard it, and a thing you have heard does not leave when you tell it to. The cleanwarden's name was Osik Thal, and he kept the doctrine the way some men keep a knife, not for use exactly, but for the comfort of having it sharp. He walked the grove twice a night with his tending rod and his ledger and his 2 undertenders, and he counted the marked, and he counted the sleeping, and he made sure the distance held. He was not cruel by the standard of cruel men. He never struck. He never starved. He kept every letter of a law that was itself the cruelty, and he kept it with the calm of a man who has never once suspected he might be wrong. And that was worse than a blow, because a blow you can forgive and that calm you cannot reach. He caught me that same night, standing too long at the 8th row. Carrier, he used the word for my work, not my name. He did not know my name and would have considered knowing it a kind of contamination. You linger. I set the basin, I said. I'm moving. He looked past me at the woman who had taken her hand from the old man's chest and folded it into her lap and gone still, the way the marked go still when the warden is near, the stillness of a thing trying to be furniture. She sings to the lapsed, he said. It is permitted. It changes nothing. They do not hear. He said it to me, but he meant it for her, the way men like that always aim their lessons at the one who cannot answer back. Do not slow your round for it. I have thought a great deal since about what I should have said, and there is a whole speech I have built in the years after, full of the right words. What I said at the time was nothing. I picked up the yoke and I went on down the row, and behind me the 3 notes started again, lower now, because she had learned to sing under his hearing, and that, the learning to sing quiet so the singing would be allowed to continue, that is the thing that stayed in me through the dead middle of the night and would not let me sleep when my shift ended. I went back the next night with an extra drum of water I had not been told to carry, and I set it down at the 8th row, and I crouched, not close. I was not a fool. I knew the rule, and I did not yet know I meant to break it, and I said the first words I ever said to her. He drinks better if you wet the reed first. The old man, the paste binds in his throat else. She did not look up at once. The marked learned not to look up, because a look can be called a reaching. When she did, her eyes were the deep indigo of the sky on a world that has a sky, a color I had not seen since I was young, and on a world that had one, and they were wet at the rims and perfectly steady, and she looked at me as if I were a sound she could not place. You are the carrier, she said. Her voice in speech was lower than in song. Mose, I said, my name is Mose. The Othrani do not give the marked a name to use. They are tendered by their work and their mark and nothing else. I watched her take the name in and hold it like something she was not sure she was allowed to keep, and she said, You should not give me that. It's mine to give, I said, wet the reed. That was the whole of it the first night. I do not want to make it more than it was. I told a woman a thing about a reed, and I told her my name, and the doctrine of a whole people says both of those were errors, and neither of them touched her, and I went on with my round. But she wet the reed, and the old man drank better, and when I came back past the 8th row at the turn of the watch, she had moved her stool a hand's width toward where I had crouched, and she was looking for me, and she stopped herself looking the moment I saw, and I understood that I had done a larger thing than I knew. I learned her in pieces, over nights, the way you learn anything you are not permitted to learn all at once. Her name was Luring. She told me on the 4th night, low, with her face turned to the sleeper so it would look like she was speaking to him. She had been in the grove 11 years. She had taken the Greyrot young. In a season she would not describe, and she had lived through it, which she said as though living had been a thing done to her rather than a thing she had done. She tended 40 cradles. She knew all 40 sleepers, their names, their faces before the sleep took the expression out of them, the small differences in how they breathed when the night was cold against the black glass. The old man at the 8th row was called Severin. He had been a teacher of children before the rot, she said, and she sang to him the 3 notes because they were the start of a counting song the Othrani teach the young, and she thought that if any part of him was still in there listening, it was the part that had spent a life teaching small ones to count, and she did not want that part to be alone with no numbers in the dark. I had carried water past Severin for 2 years, and I had not known his name, or that he had taught children, or that he was being sung the start of a counting song every night by a woman the rest of his people would not stand within a rod's length of. I had thought of the cradles as cargo. She had made every one of them a person, alone, with her bare hands, for 11 years, and no one had ever brought her a second drum of water for the trouble. I started bringing the second drum every night. I told the supply ledger it was spillage. The supply ledger did not care. The supply line came down once a season from a station that had stopped thinking about Irevan the day they assigned me to it, and as long as the numbers closed, nobody on the far end ever asked whether the water reached a person or the ground. Then I started bringing other things. This is the part the doctrine has the most to say about, and I want to set it down honestly because the honesty is the whole point. The gray paste the sleepers were fed was also what we fed the tenders, because the tenders were marked and the marked ate what would not be missed. It was enough to live on and nothing more, a flat gray nothing that you swallowed because the body insisted. The supply line, though, carried a few stores meant for me, the human, because no one had ever bothered to take them off the manifest: hard bread, a wax of pressed fruit, a tin of salt. I had eaten alone for 19 years. I had stopped tasting any of it. On the 9th night, I broke the hard bread in half and I set half of it on the rim of Lurine's basin, and I crouched, and I ate my half where she could see me eat it. She looked at the bread a long time. "If the warden sees," she said. "He's at the 12th row." I counted his round. I had been counting Osik Thal's round for a week, the way you count anything you are planning to work around. Eat it before he comes back, or don't. It's yours either way. She took it with a care that I have not been able to forget. Not greed, there was greed in her. 11 years of gray nothing will put greed in anyone, but she did not let the greed move her hand. She took it the way you take a thing that has been offered to you as if you were a person, when you have spent a third of your life being treated as a contagion with hands. She ate it slowly. She closed her eyes once in the middle and opened them and went on. And when it was gone, she folded her empty hands in her lap and she said, so low I had to lean to hear it, and leaning was itself a crime. "No one has shared a thing with me since I went down into the rot." Then it was overdue, I said, which was a poor thing to say, but I was not a man of speeches, and it was true. I want to be plain about what was between us, because the world the doctrine comes from would put the worst possible name to it, and the worst possible name would be a lie. What was between us was recognition. I do not have a better word, and I have looked for one. I saw that there was a person inside the mark, a whole one, a person who knew 40 sleepers by name and sang counting songs into the dark, so a teacher would not be alone, and she felt herself be seen, after 11 years of being looked past, and the being seen went through her like water through ground that has been dry too long. That is all it was. It was the largest thing I have ever been part of, and it was made of bread and water and a name, and a man crouching a little too close. I have done other work in my life. None of it was this size. The bare hand came on the 14th night, and it came by accident, which is the only way a thing that large could have come. Severin took a turn for the worse. I do not know the Othrani medicine, and I will not pretend to. But I came down the 8th row with my drums, and Lurine was on her feet over his cradle, both hands on him, and his breathing had gone to a thin scrape, a sound like a reed split down its length, and she looked at me with her steady wet eyes gone wide, and she said, "He is leaving. He is leaving, and there is no one to hold the other side." The Othrani, when one of theirs is dying, hold them two on a side, hands on the shoulders and the brow, so the leaving one is held into the leaving and not pushed out alone. It is a decent thing. It is one of the decent things they have. But the dying here were marked, and the marked may not be touched, and so the marked died held by one pair of marked hands at most, and Severin was dying with Lurine's 2 hands on his chest and the whole other side of him empty. No one to take his shoulder, no one to take his brow, because I was the only other body in the row, and I was a human who had been on Erevan 19 years and had touched no one in all that time, and the rule said the rule said the rule said. I set the yoke down, and I went around to the other side of the cradle, and I put my hand on Severin's brow. It was the first living thing I had touched in 19 years. I want you to sit with that the way I have had to. 19 years of carrying water to bodies I was not permitted to touch, of eating alone, of speaking to a supply ledger that did not answer, and the first warm skin under my hand was a dying stranger's, and across him, a woman with charcoal streaked down her arms was looking at me as though I had reached up and taken hold of the moon and pulled it down to where she could see it. We held him. He took a long time, and then he took no time at all, the way of it. The thin scrape stopped between one breath and the place a breath should have been. Lurine sang the 3 notes one more time, all the way through to where the counting song would have gone on if there had been more of it, and then she was quiet, and I kept my hand on Severin's cooling brow because I did not yet know the form of when to take it away, and she reached across him and laid her bare marked hand over the back of mine. That was the touch, her hand over my hand on a dead man's brow in a grove on the dark face of a moon. It was the most that doctrine forbade, and it was nothing. It was nothing. It was warmth and weight and the simple fact of 2 people who had each been alone agreeing, without a word, not to be. Her eyes were wet and they did not spill. I have known the word dignity my whole life, and I did not understand it until a marked woman put her hand over mine and held it there steady, and let me see that she was grieving and did not break. "Thank you," she said, "for holding the other side." "Anyone would have," I said. "No," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the long, clean knowledge of the facts of her life. "No one would have. You did. Osikthal found us like that. I heard the rod before I heard the man, the tap of it on the stone, his measure, the count of his round, which I had let myself stop counting because Severin was leaving, and there are things that are larger than a warden's round. The tap stopped. I looked up, and the cleanwarden was standing at the head of the 8th row with his ledger open and his 2 undertenders behind him, and he was looking at my hand and her hand and the dead man under both, and his calm was on him like a frost. "Carrier," he said, "step back." I did not step back. I want to be honest that it was not courage in the moment. It was that Severin was newly dead under my hand, and it seemed a foul thing to take my hand off him to obey a man who had never once held the other side of anyone. "He's passed," I said. "We held him through it." "You touched the cinder tended." He said it without heat, reading it off the air the way he read his ledger. "You touched the lapsed dead. You are contaminated, Carrier, and worse, you have made a public thing of contamination in the rows before the tenders." He looked at Lurine, and to her he said the worst thing he had said yet, and he said it mildly. "And you let him. You knew the doctrine and you let him touch you. And now there is a human's contamination spread through the grove, and it will be your fault when the council asks how." "It's no one's fault that a man held a dying man," I said. "There's no contamination. The rot doesn't pass by a hand. You know it doesn't. None of you take it from tending them. 11 years she's had her hands on the sleeping, and not one tender has caught it from the touch, because it doesn't pass that way, and every one of you knows it, and the rule isn't about catching anything. The rule is about not having to look." I should not have said it. It was true, and I should not have said it, because a man like Osikthal can survive being wrong, but he cannot survive being told. He is wrong in front of the people the wrong is done to. And I had just done that in the rows, with the tenders all gone still and listening in the dark. He closed his ledger. "The grove will be assessed," he said. "All of it. The council has spoken of it before. Too many lapsed, too many marked, an expense on the dark face of a moon for bodies that will not wake. I will recommend the assessment now, with cause." He looked at the rows of cradles, all that breathing, all those 40 times 40 sleepers, and he looked at the tenders crouched over them. And I understood, the way you understand a drop in pressure before the storm, what assessment meant when it was said about a grove of the sleeping that an old man had just been told was too expensive to keep. "You have made this necessary, Carrier. Remember that you made it necessary." He went. The rod tapped away down the row and out the low door, and the grove let out a breath it had been holding. All those tenders, all at once. The small sound of people who have just heard a sentence read and do not yet know its term. Lureen took her hand off mine. She did it gently. "You should not have spoken," she said. "Not for me. They will move now because of what you said, and the sleeping." She stopped. She looked down the long rows of her 40 and the hundreds beyond them. "The sleeping cannot be moved. They die in the moving. He knows that. Assessment is how they will say it." "Then we don't let them," I said, which was a foolish thing to say for a water carrier and a marked woman against a council on a far station. And I said it anyway, because I had held the other side of a dying man, and I was not going back to being a thing that carried cargo past people. She looked at me a long moment with her steady, wet indigo eyes, and then she did a thing she had not done in 11 years. She told me later. She told me who she was. "Mose," she said. She had taken the name fully by now. She used it like a hand-hold. "There is something you do not know about me, and I have not said it to anyone in this grove, because here it does not matter, and saying it would only be a danger. But it may matter now against the council, and so I will say it to you, and you will decide what it is worth." She was quiet a moment. Down the row, the tenders had gone back to their sleepers, because grief in the grove does not excuse you from the work. The work is the one thing that goes on. "Before the rot," she said, "I had a house. I do not mean a roof. Among the Othrini a house is a line, a blood, a seat. My house was Othrin. We held the eastern reaches and a vote in the council, and a name that was old before the doctrine of the clean was ever written. I was the heir of it. I was being taught to hold the seat. And then the Greyrot came into the eastern reaches, into my house, into me. And a house cannot have a marked heir. The doctrine will not seat a marked body. And so my house did the thing the doctrine required. It put it about that the heir of Othrin had died in the rot with the rest, and it gave me to the grove, because the grove was where the marked who lived were sent. And a living heir is a scandal, but a dead one is only a grief. My own people buried me alive in a name that said I was dead. And they did it cleanly, the way Osikthal does everything, every letter of the law kept. And they have ruled the eastern reaches as a house without an heir for 11 years, and looked for a husband to bring a new line in. And I have sung counting songs in the dark, and that is the whole of it. I crouched there with the dead man between us, and I did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing to say to it that would not be too small. Then I said the only true thing I had. "Then they were wrong about you too, the same way. They decided not to look, and they called the not looking a death, and they went on." "Yes," she said. "Does anyone know you're alive? Anyone who'd have a reason to want you to be?" She turned her face away, toward Severin, the habit of the marked, the speaking to the sleeper so the speaking would not be seen. "There was a captain," she said, "of my house's guard, Davin Ostrak. He held me as a child on his shoulders at the Reach festivals. He did not believe the death. He said so, and a guard who will not believe the death of an heir is a danger to a house that needs the death believed, and so they sent him off a posting at the edge of the holdings, far, a guard of nothing. I do not know if he lives. I do not know if he kept looking. I gave him a thing the night before they brought me here. A token. The seal of the heir, the small one that goes on the inside of the wrist, that only the heir wears, that they would have wanted destroyed. I gave it to him, and I told him to keep it until there was a reason to bring it back, and we both knew there would never be a reason, and we both pretended there might, because it is a thing you do for someone you love at the end of the world." She said it without weeping. I have told you that her eyes were always wet at the rims and always steady, and I have come to understand that this was not a small thing. It was the discipline of a person who had decided, somewhere in 11 years, that she would grieve everything and break for nothing, and had held to it. Wet but unbroken. I had not known a person could be that before her. I have measured everyone against it since. The searchers came 9 nights later, and they came on the same night the assessment did, which I have never decided was the cruelty of chance or the design of it. The assessment came first. Osik came down the low door at the start of the night, not with his rod and his 2 undertenders, but with a delegation, 3 of the unmarked in the pale formal gray of the council's hand, and a scribe, and a thing I had not seen in 19 years on Ereven, a clean-suited physician with a case of instruments, who would, I understood at once, be the one to do the assessing. They came to count the sleeping and weigh them against the cost of keeping bodies that would not wake, on a moon that turned a dark face to the sun, and to recommend, gently, in the formal gray, with every letter kept, that the expense be ended. I put myself in the low door. A water carrier in a doorway is not much of a wall, but it was the wall I had. "You'll not move the sleeping," I said. "They die in the moving. Everyone in this grove knows it, and so do you." The council's hand was a tall Othreni with a voice made for rooms larger than this one. "We do not propose to move them, carrier," he said, and the gentleness of it was the worst thing in the grove that night. "We propose to assess whether they should continue to be kept. There is a difference. The laps do not wake. They consume the stores of a moon. The doctrine does not require the clean to ruin themselves keeping the as good as dead. We will assess, and we will recommend, and the council will decide, and it will be done lawfully and without cruelty." Without cruelty. He believed it. That is the thing I have never gotten past. He stood in a grove of the breathing sleeping and proposed to end them, and believed there was a way to do it without cruelty because it would be done with every letter kept. And behind him in the rows, the tenders had risen from their stools, all of them, the cinder-tended, the marked, standing over their sleepers in the dark. Not advancing, they had 11 years of not advancing in them, but standing between the delegation and the cradles, with their bare marked hands at their sides, and luring at the head of them in front of her 40, with her chin level and her wet eyes steady. And I understood that whatever the doctrine said about what the marked were, the marked had decided, tonight in the dark, to be a wall too. That was when the other door opened. Not the low door, the high door. The freight door at the far end of the grove that had not been opened in my memory because nothing large ever came to Ereven. It opened, and the cold of the dark face came in, and through it came armed Othreni in the deep green and gray of a house's guard, travel-worn, far from any holding, led by an old soldier with a face cut deep by years and a long road, and he came into the grove of the sleeping with his hand on no weapon and his eyes going down the rows, searching. The way a man searches who has searched a long time and has nearly stopped believing he will find. The council's hand turned, affronted. "This is a closed grove. By what right?" "By the right of House Othving," the old soldier said, and his voice was wrecked and quiet, and it carried anyway. "I am Davin Ostrek, captain of its guard, and I have spent 11 years on a posting at the edge of the world looking for a grave I did not believe in. And 3 seasons ago a tale reached me, at the edge of the world, of a marked woman in a grove on the dark face of Ereven who sings the counting song of the eastern reaches to the dying. The song the heir of Othving was taught as a child, and no one else in the reaches knows entire, and I have come a long way to learn whether the tale is true." He went down the rows with his eyes, "and I have brought a thing to test it." He drew it from inside his coat. A small disc, dark metal, the kind of thing that looks like nothing until you know what it is. The seal of the heir, the small one, the one that goes on the inside of the wrist. The grove had gone entirely still. Even the breathing of the sleeping seemed to hush, though that is only what memory does to a moment, makes the whole world hold for it. Davin Ostrek's eyes found luring. I watched it cross him, the not daring, the 11 years of not daring crashing into the wanting, the old soldier's face working the way a thing works that has been held rigid so long it has forgotten how to move. He came down the 8th row slowly. He stopped a rod's length from her, because even he, even now, had the distance in him, the doctrine in the bone. And Lurine stood over her 40 with the charcoal streaked down her arms and her chin level, and she looked at the captain who had carried her on his shoulders at the Reach festivals, and she did not move toward him, because the marked do not move toward the clean, and she let him see her, and that was the bravest thing in a grove that had a great deal of bravery in it that night. "It's late, Davin," she said. Her voice did not shake. "You took a long road for a dead woman." The old captain made a sound I will not try to write. He went down, not a bow, the legs simply went. He went down onto the stone of the 8th row, a rod's length from the marked air of his house, in front of the council's hand and the clean warden and the clean physician with his case. And he held the seal of the air up in his 2 hands toward her, and he said, my lady, you are not dead. I would not let them say you were dead. You are not dead." And he reached across the rod's length, across 11 years, across the doctrine, across every letter of the clean, and he took her marked hand and he pressed the seal into it and closed her fingers over it with both of his, and held them there, the way you hold a dying man into the leaving, except that he was holding a living woman into the living, holding her back into the line they had buried her out of, and his face was wet and not steady at all. The way an old soldier's face is when the thing he stopped believing in walks up out of the dark and is true. I will not tell you the rooms of it that came after, the council's hand and his scribe scrambling at the law, the seal verified, the bloodwright the physician was made to run with his clean instruments to prove what the song had already proved, the Eastern reaches 11-year fiction coming apart in the formal gray. That is the part the doctrine cares about, the seat, the line, the heir returned, the legal undoing of a legal murder. It is not the part I care about, and it is not why I am telling you this. And a marked woman taught me that the part the doctrine cares about is never the part that matters. Here is the part that matters. When it was settled, when Davin Ostrek's guard stood at the high door, and the council's hand had gone away to write a different recommendation than the one he came to write, because you do not assess a grove for ending on the same night you discover it has been hiding the lawful heir of a council house, and the assessment died there, quietly, of embarrassment, which is the only thing that ever kills a thing like that. When all of it was settled, and the grove was the grove again, all that breathing under the black glass. Lureen came and found me in the low door, where I had stood my poor wall all night. She had the seal closed in her marked hand. She was the heir of Othvin again, by law, by blood, by a counting song sung to a dying teacher in the dark. She could leave the dark face of Erevan. She could take the eastern reaches and the seat and the vote in the council, and they would have to seat her, marked or not, because the law that buried her was the same law that now had to dig her up, and there is a justice in that I have learned to be satisfied with. "They will want me to go," she said. "Tonight, Davin will want it. The reaches have been a house without an heir for 11 years, and there is much undone." She looked at me with her steady, wet eyes. "I am to be a lady again. I am to be touched again and bowed to and seated, and I will never carry water past a person I am not allowed to touch for the rest of my life, and it is because an old man would not believe a lie, and because of you." "Not because of me," I said. "You sang the song, he came for the song, I just carried water." "You held the other side," she said. And I had no answer to that, because she was right, and because the whole of it, the bread and the water and the name and the hand on a dead man's brow, the whole of it had only ever been a man deciding to hold the other side of someone the rest of a world had left to be alone. And that is not nothing. I have learned. That is very nearly everything. "Will you go?" I asked her tonight. She looked back down the long rows of the grove, at the 40 cradles that were hers, at Severin's, empty now, stripped, waiting for whoever the dark face of the moon would send next into the long sleep. At the other tenders, the marked, the cinder-tended, standing over their sleepers in the dark, who would still be marked in the morning and still untouchable, and still alone with the sleeping, heir or no heir, because one woman being dug out of a grave does not undo a doctrine, it only embarrasses it for a night. "No," she said. I did not understand it at first. I thought she meant not tonight. She saw that I did not understand, and she explained it to me the way she explained everything plainly, with her face turned a little toward the sleeping out of 11 years of habit. "I have a seat to take, and I will take it, because a marked woman in the council is a stone the doctrine will have to build itself around for the rest of its life, and I mean to be a very large stone, but I will not take it from a holding in the eastern reaches with clean hands waiting on me. I will take it from here. The long lull will be mine. A marked air can hold a marked grove. There is no letter against it. I have already found the letter, and the stores will come, and the assessment will never come again, because the Lady of Othvin keeps this grove, and you do not assess the holding of a council house. The sleeping will be kept. The tenders will be fed something better than gray nothing. And the next time a man goes down into the long sleep in this grove, there will be hands on both sides of him, because I will make it lawful for there to be, if I have to spend the seat and the vote and the whole of the dug-up rest of my life making it so. Her wet eyes were steady on me. I am going to be the heir who would not leave the grove. They will hate it. It will be the most useful thing I ever do. The lamps were coming up. Our Dawn, the maid one, the only one the dark face of Ireven ever gets. It came up gray gold along the black glass, and the breathing of the sleeping went on under it, and the captain's guard waited at the high door, and Davin Ostrek stood among them watching his lady with the look of a man who has gotten back the one thing he stopped letting himself want. And luring of house, Othvin stood in the low door of a grove on the dark face of a moon, and asked me, without quite asking it, the only question that was left. The grove needs a carrier, she said. It has always needed a carrier. The seat will not change that. The water will still have to come. It will, I said. And a carrier who will hold the other side. There has only ever been the one. She looked at me, steady, wet, unbroken, marked, the air of a house and the woman I had shared half a hard loaf with in the dark, and she said, "Stay, Mose. Take the watch with me. I will not ask it as a lady. I am asking it as the woman you brought a second drum of water to when no one had shared a thing with me in 11 years. Stay, and we will keep them, all of them, both sides held, for as long as the dark face turns." I had been alone on Ireven 19 years. I had carried water to bodies I was not allowed to touch. I had eaten alone and spoken to a ledger and worn myself smooth as a coin you cannot read. And a marked woman had taken the bread I offered as if she were a person, and put her hand over mine on a dead man's brow, and stood a wall in front of her 40 against a council come to end them, and dug herself out of a grave with a counting song, and turned down a holding to keep a grove of the sleeping. And now she was standing in a doorway in the maid Dawn asking me not to be alone any more, and asking it as plainly as she had taught me to say everything. I set the yoke down off my shoulders. I had carried it so long the weight of its absence felt like falling. I took her marked hand in both of mine, the way the captain had, the way you hold a person into the living, and I held it in the low door in the gray gold light, in front of the guard and the captain and the standing tenders and all the breathing rows. "I'll take the watch," I said, "both sides held, as long as the dark face turns." That was the vow. There was no court for it, and no seal, and no formal gray. Only a water carrier and the marked air of a fallen house holding hands in a doorway while a moon kept its dark face to the sun. And it has held now longer than any clean vow I ever heard sworn. And it will hold after I am one of the sleeping myself, because she will be at the other side of my cradle when I go down, with her bare marked hand on me, singing whatever song she decides a man like me should not be alone with in the dark. The lamps came all the way up. Down the 8th row, a tender I did not yet know the name of began to sing, low, 3 notes, the start of a counting song, into the breathing dark. And Lurine looked at me, and her eyes were wet, and they did not spill, and we went in together to fill the basins, because the water still had to come, and there were both sides to hold, and we were no longer carrying any of it alone.